get started with the show, we wanted to draw your attention to our crowdfunding page on Patreon. If you've been enjoying Always Take Notes, please do consider supporting us there. It helps us to keep the podcast going.
If you support us on Patreon, you can get a great selection of rewards as well as a shout out on the show. Thanks to our latest donor, Martin Horn.
Martin is an aspiring novelist. He worked as a feature writer a few years ago, and he's done some institutional communications work before becoming a marketing consultant, which is what he does full time. He's gone back to school to do a master's in English with a focus on post-war British spy fiction, which sounds fascinating. Good luck with all of your writing endeavours, Martin.
We've recently launched a new tier for our most generous supporters. If you pledge $20 a month, you get a free 2-month trial to Otter worth $26. Otter offers automated transcription and live note-taking for in-person and virtual meetings. I found it to be a huge help handling interview audio with my magazine work. You also get access to a series of mini episodes from previous guests on the show in which they answer 3 revealing questions. The latest episode features Jonathan Beckman, the deputy editor of 1843 magazine, and here's a snippet.
I would say that all writing careers are affected by a sense of constant failure, and that the mark of a true writer is really to think that every piece you've written has somehow failed to come up to the mark. I think this is actually a kind of function of writing itself, that what you really want to be able to do is say everything that you know simultaneously, but you're actually trapped by having to work within the linear confines of the written word. But the specific time that I failed was when I was writing my book on atheism.
Hello, and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, we spoke to magazine writer and author Samira Shackle.
We spoke with Samira about Karachi Vice, her book that aims to get under the skin of Pakistan's largest city, about her magazine writing work, and her fascinating investigation into the curious case of the Gatwick drone.
It's a great episode. We hope you enjoy it. Welcome, Samira, to Always Take Notes. It's great to have you on the show. Could we start by talking about your book, Karachi Vice, how you came up with the idea, the pieces that it grew out of from The Guardian, if you could just sort of spin the yarn of how it came to be.
Yeah, sure. So the book grew out of reporting that I'd been doing for several years. So I actually started reporting on Karachi back in 2011 when I first went freelance. I left my job at the New Statesman and I moved to Pakistan, which is where I've got family. It's where my mum's from. And I moved in with relatives in Karachi in 2012 and lived there for about 6 months and reported on the city. And the whole Pakistan was in a kind of terrible situation then in terms of terrorist violence and various different issues in Karachi, including organised crime and so on. So that was kind of how I kick-started my freelance career. And then after about a year in Pakistan, so 6 months in Karachi, 6 months in Islamabad covering the election, I came back. But I was still really drawn to Karachi. It was just such a complicated and such a fascinating place with so many different things going on. And I found myself kind of constantly coming up with different sort of story ideas and going back there over the years. And the book, as you say, grew out of a couple of pieces that I did. The first was in 2015. It was my first piece for The Guardian long read. And it was a profile of a crime reporter in Karachi who ended up featuring them in the book. And then about a year later, I did a piece which was originally for Mosaic, which was an online publication run by the Wellcome Trust, which had quite generous travel money, which was great. But it was also republished by The Guardian. And that was quite a similar piece, I guess. It was profiling an ambulance driver in the city. And in the course of doing those two pieces, I noticed that these two people, although they didn't know each other at all, had experienced lots of the same big seismic events in the city, had kind of been through these big attacks and so on together. And that made me think about the points of overlap and maybe expanding it into a book, which I then did with 3 other people alongside those two.
What I thought was striking about the long read profile of the TV reporter, I thought it was incredibly powerful. It's like just how high the levels of violence are, like how many people are getting killed, how like as this sort of state of war analogy. Had you spent much like appreciable amounts of time in Karachi before you went back there in 2011, 2012, or were you kind of did you have a point of reference of what the city was like from visiting family earlier, or was that your immediate sort of year zero impression of it when you were there?
Yeah, I hadn't actually spent much time there, so I'd spent some time there when I was very little, but too little to remember. So kind of two or three. We spent about a year in Pakistan and India, but I hadn't really been back. It was a place that kind of existed quite a lot in conversation, and my mum's memories of it, and my grandparents and my aunts and uncles and so on. And my family from there spent a lot of time in London, so I felt kind of connected in that way, but I hadn't actually been myself since childhood until I went back in 2011. So it was quite I guess quite a kind of fresh impression. And then on the first trip I made in 2011, I went with my mum, and I did do some reporting, but it was also a kind of family visit. And we're very much within the kind of wealthier areas operate a bit like a city within a city. I mean, it's such a big place that there's kind of like multiple cities all next to each other, as are many of these big mega cities. And you can kind of forget that this level of violence is going on because it's quite cloistered and protected, and people have private supplies of water, and people have armed guards, and all of those things. So it comes up in conversation what's going on, but it doesn't necessarily intrude on your day-to-day in quite the same way. And then it was over the process of the next, I guess the next decade really, I've sort of developed my own relationship with the place, and the different cities that make up Karachi, and the different areas that make up the totality of the city. But certainly when I lived there in 2012, I got a sense of the violence that was happening, not just because of the work I was doing, but also even in those cloistered, wealthier areas, it really does. It kind of erupts. It might just be you have to change your plans around, but because there's a gun battle in one area of the city, so you can't drive through it. And sure, life continues as normal in other parts of the city, but that's still something that just kind of becomes almost mundane. So yeah, it really was an extraordinary level of violence. It's much improved now, but yeah.
Did you ever personally feel at risk? I mean, you tell a story in the book of driving home from dinner and being surrounded by people on motorbikes firing into the air. Did you, as a reporter, did you ever feel that you were at risk?
Yeah, I think so. So that was a moment where I guess ultimately nothing happened and I was safe, but I did feel really scared. That was the MQM, which is one of the most powerful political parties in the area, was calling a strike, and I was driving home, and there were gunmen from the party driving around shooting into the air, which was the symbol to let people know that they needed to go home and shut up shop. So that was really frightening. I think when I lived there particularly, and then subsequently up until about 2015 on trips back, you're so acutely aware of the security risk. So that's things like being very aware of the risk of armed robbery, which can happen even though you travel around a lot by car. Gunmen on motorbikes pulling up next to you. It didn't actually happen to me, but I was very aware of the threat. And the thing that worried me the most, I think, was the kidnap risk. If you're a foreigner, if you're wealthy, kidnap is not now, but at that point was more common than a mugging would be in London. It really happened all the time, kidnapping for ransom. So that's something that I was very acutely aware of on different reporting trips, particularly when doing anything sensitive or anything involving terror groups or organised crime groups. So that would be, you kind of offset the risk by varying your routine or changing your car or changing where you're staying after a few days and so on. But it's definitely a present fear and a risk that does need to be offset.
Could you tell us about the mechanics of how you got a book deal and how that worked? On the show we always like to lift the lid on this. So how did it go from that long read in The Guardian to getting the deal with Granta and so forth?
Yeah, so I actually did this in quite an unusual way. So I had this idea for the book for about a year and was sort of half doing the proposal, and as I'm sure, I don't know if you found this, but I found it quite difficult to motivate myself because there's just an extraordinary amount of work needs to go into a proposal, and you don't necessarily have a guarantee of anything at the end of it. So I was sort of had it half done and wasn't quite finishing it, basically. And then Granta, or their then non-fiction arm, Portobello, which has now been folded into Granta, launched a competition for non-fiction proposals for first-time authors. And I thought I'd enter it so that I would have a deadline, basically, because I think years of being a journalist has kind of broken my brain for doing anything without a deadline. So I entered that thinking it would just be a sort of good reason to get my proposal finished, and then won it. And so that meant I got the deal with Granta and their agent I'm now represented by as a result of that. And then after that point, it kind of progressed like a normal book negotiation would. I then, although there was the understanding that Granta was going to publish it, I then kind of worked on the proposal a bit with the agent, who then took it to Granta and negotiated what the advance would be and so on. So it was a slightly strange way around of doing it, although it did then revert to maybe as it would be, except that it didn't go to other publishers.
With the proposal, did you have all the characters that you have in the book picked out at that point?
I had an idea of the types of stories I wanted and the areas of the city in particular, different conflicts that I wanted to represent in it, but I didn't have all the people. So I think I had the two that I'd already written about, the crime reporter and the ambulance driver, and also a map maker, Siraj, who did end up featuring in the final book, who I'd met briefly in the course of some other reporting in Karachi. And then the others I put kind of placeholders, so people I'd read about or people like stories I'd read about, and I kind of filled it in. It's a bit of a weird thing with a book proposal. You're kind of expected to write it as if you've already done all the research, but you obviously haven't done all the research. So you don't want to make things up. But it's I sort of cobbled together those extra bits from other pieces, and on the kind of knowing at the time that I would go and find people. So I knew I wanted someone from the Liari, which was an area that was consumed by gang war, for instance. So I just put in someone who I'd read interviews with, and later I found someone new. And the other thing is that actually in the proposal, I think I had like 7 or 8 people in it, and in the end I only had 5. And that was something that, working on the proposal and discussing it with the publishers, I had an idea that you know I would need loads and loads and loads for a book, and they sort of made the point that it would be better to have fewer and told more thoroughly.
I think the proposal piece is so interesting because certainly my experience was like you have to feel your way through it because you've not done it before, and there's this sort of theoretical, you know, the 3 chapters and synopsis model of doing it. But I certainly found I was really feel my way through it. But with yours, and this is real like geeky, always take note stuff, which we love. But did you have a sample chapter, like a specific bit of narrative prose ready at that stage, or was the long read used as that, or how did you kind of cut that? And I had one other question I was interested in. This is again real kind of inside baseball stuff. But with that competition that you'd won, were you then in a position where it had to go to Granta, so you couldn't take it more broadly to market at that stage?
Yes, so that's right. So there was a kind of commitment from when I accepted the prize. There was a commitment that it was going to go to Granta, and then on the other point, I did have a sample chapter, which I sort of put it together based on the 2 long reads that I'd done, so the crime reporter and the ambulance driver. But what I wanted to do was to show what the points of overlap would be. So I wrote it. There's a chapter that's actually in the book now. It's very different to how it was in the proposal, but about the attack on the airport, which happened a few years ago. I think it was 2014. And both the crime reporter and the ambulance driver had been there separately, not knowing each other, and had experienced this and had talked to me about it. And that was one of the things that had got me thinking about the book. So I sort of took some material from each of those pieces and the interview material around it, and kind of wrote an account of the airport attack from cutting between their 2 perspectives. And in the end, I obviously re-interviewed them a lot, and I think I had more detail, and it was the writing just ends up being more kind of expansive in the final version. But I did have that. And when I reworked the proposal with the agent, in the end, that wasn't a full chapter. In the end, it was sort of fragments and scenes. So I had that, which was, I guess it was about half a chapter, and then I wrote some sort of scenes from other places in the book to give a sense of the different kind of range of stories, and that was on my agent's advice. I don't know if that approach would have worked if I hadn't already been in conversation with Granta or not, the kind of more fragmentary approach. I know that the general advice is that you should have a fully written through chapter.
Could you tell us a little bit about how you picked your subject? Because I was struck when reading your book about how poignant Safdar's backstory is in terms of why he chose to become an ambulance driver. Did you interview him a little bit and then think, yes, this has actually got, you know, the potential for it could sustain a long story and it could sustain part of the book? or did you sort of interview a few people and then like kind of winnow it down?
Yeah, so when I was doing the piece, the long form piece about ambulance drivers, I spoke to a few different ambulance drivers, and he was just by far the easiest to talk to. I mean, he's like a real character. He's really funny and he talks loads, and he's kind of very expressive with emotion. And I guess always with these kinds of pieces, and particularly with the book, the main criteria, I guess, is people who are able and willing to talk in a certain way about their experiences, because not everyone is used to relating things that have happened to them in enough detail that you can convincingly reconstruct it, or not everyone, really speaks in that mode, and he really did. So for that original piece, I spent like a week just going out and about with him during his work, and there was inevitably quite a lot of time sitting around and chatting, and that's when I kind of got all his different backstories and his childhood and so on. And then when I came to do the book, I had a really good relationship with him already, so it was quite easy to go and spend a few more days and fill in the blanks. And I hadn't met his family when I was doing the original piece, but when I came back later, I did kind of spend some time with his family and sort of see him after a couple of years, which was really nice. Someone like that who I guess I first wrote about him in 2016. You can build a really nice relationship with.
Can we talk a bit about narrative nonfiction as a genre, both maybe to explain to people who aren't familiar with it, but also what your approach was to try and write stuff that had novelistic fluency and flair and point of view and so forth, and in terms of pinning that down and getting the factual details? How did you that's such a central part of the kind of work that you do, both in the book and in the magazine stuff. So maybe, explain what it is for those who aren't familiar, and then how you went about just procedurally reporting and writing in that vein.
Yeah, so narrative nonfiction, I guess, as you say, is a nonfiction, a factual story that uses some devices of fiction. So it's generally got a beginning, middle, and end. It might be told quite descriptively. And there's obviously different shades of that. So I think while I do sort of long form journalistic pieces, the writing in the book is probably more novelistic than I would do for a journalistic piece that was going in a newspaper or magazine, although there's obviously lots of overlap and the kind of basic approach is the same. And this book was I've got a note at the end actually kind of specifying that it's not a work of history. It's based on the subjective experiences of these people. So I kind of I checked things where I could, and in some instances, if I wasn't sure if something was true or not, or not because people were lying, but because people's memories can be unreliable, I just generally didn't include it. So I sort of check things against like news reports and my own knowledge and my own reporting. Sometimes check things with people, other people who are there, family and friends. But I thought a lot about this actually while I was doing the book, and I kind of made the judgment that you don't really want people to feel like aggressively checked up on. So it's kind of if I really couldn't find things from other sources, or if I really wasn't sure if something had happened, that's when I'd sort of double check things with other people who were there at the time. And often that happened quite organically because I was spending so much time with people and their family and their workplaces, so it kind of often happened organically, which is the best thing, that people, other people would be around and you can just check things without it seeming like you're, casting aspersions on someone. And then the other thing I thought about quite a lot, which I think about anyway in my journalism, but felt more pressing with the book, was just the kind of ethics maybe of reconstructing someone else's experience, especially when it was for things that I wasn't there for. And I really did do huge amounts of interviewing and spending time with these people, but there's I think you're inevitably, when you are spending that much time with people, you're inevitably selecting the details that will make and that will be interesting to the reader and that will give the reader a full picture or whatever, but you're kind of selecting and shaping it into a narrative. And I always want people to to recognize themselves in what I write, but obviously it's kind of my impression of them to an extent as well, shapes what you choose and what will make the most compelling narrative. So I thought a lot about that and grappled with it quite a lot. And generally, I think the fact that I had spent so much time with people helped me to feel sort of confident in some of those choices about what to leave out and what to include. But yeah, it's definitely tricky when you're dealing with real living people's experiences. I guess it's kind of like writing a series of mini biographies in a way.
When you were doing your reporting, did you use recorders? Did you just have a kind of notebook and pen to note down details as you went along? How did you wrangle all of that material?
Both. So I generally have a recorder running and also write notes in a notebook as well. Yeah, generally did both. So partly just from paranoia about losing one or the other, and partly because actually the written notes ended up being really helpful because I was interviewing people and chatting to them for so long and often working with a translator, which meant I did have time to kind of write down notes. It was really, really helpful for kind of picking out the most important bits, especially when sometimes I was doing like 2.5 week reporting trips and reporting every single day, like all day. So just having a sort of written record where I might write down the time in the recording that was a really key moment or something was really helpful. And the other thing, which was a nice byproduct, was that I was just writing down observations as well, especially when working with a translator, just sort of writing down things I saw or describing things or the way someone looked or whatever. And that stuff you can't really capture on a recorder. And a lot of the description that ended up in the book was kind of observations that I'd written down in the moment, whether that was of like the physical appearance of areas or of people's appearances or rooms or whatever. Kind of having that. Some people like to work with photos, but I think I'm quite sort of verbal and word based, so I really liked having sort of descriptions that I'd written down there and then. It really helped.
How did you handle the language piece? Because you speak some Urdu, but not completely fluently, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I speak some, but it's not good enough for me to feel confident interviewing. I think I would miss a lot of nuances. It's quite broken when I speak. So I wanted people to be able to speak in the language they were most comfortable in, which for like 4 out of 5 of the people was Urdu. So I worked with a translator who's a really good friend of mine, and she's amazing. And I can kind of, when someone's speaking in Urdu, I can follow along. So I sort of know roughly what they're saying, but she was able to just give me the real kind of word for word and all the nuance, which was really invaluable to have that, I think. And then I also drafted in my mum for some checking audio transcripts and translating some bits at the last minute. Got some unpaid labour from my parents.
I can't remember. We've interviewed someone else who said that their mother was an unsung hero in their work.
I think it's come up more than once on the show actually.
I'm sure.
The maternal.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wondered why in your book, in some of the chapters, you're sort of present in the story. You're sort of drawing readers' attention to the fact that you're asking them certain things at certain times, and what you think the merits of that approach is.
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's also something I thought quite a lot about. I was very resistant to making it a book about me and my journeys through the place. I think often women get pushed towards writing in a autobiographical mode, and it's fine if you want to, but I didn't really. I think it felt important to sometimes show the framing and remind people that this is being refracted through a reporter. And it also felt like there were a few moments where, while I was doing the reporting, where the way someone said something to me or the context in which it was said felt like it was illuminating in some way, and I wanted to be able to share that. So that's why I kind of opted to sort of dot that in a few places, but without making it the focus.
Could we roll back now a bit from the book to your kind of broader career in journalism? How did that get started? We should say that Samira and I were at university together, so there's a bit of overlap from this. But when did you know that was somewhere that you wanted to go, and how did you go about making your steps in that direction?
Yeah, sure. So I think I was one of those people who basically always wanted to be a writer. So when I was a small child, I was like scribbling on bits of paper and stapling together and sort of proudly telling my parents I'd written a book. So I always knew I wanted to do that, and journalism was something I'd thought about as a way to basically have a job and also be a writer. So I knew I was interested in it from my teens. And then at university, I got involved with the student paper, which I ended up editing, and then did a few summer work experiences between my second and third year. I think I did one, a quite random mix at Cosmopolitan magazine and at Time Out. And then I applied for a load of things, like unpaid stuff, for when I finished university. So I ended up I did the Guardian's Positive Action Scheme, which was for ethnic minorities, which was set up and still run, I think, by Joseph Harker, who works at the Guardian, and he's an incredible champion of diversity in the media. So that was a really, really good scheme. Unlike any other work experience I'd done, it was incredibly structured, and you were given a mentor within the building, and you got to kind of go to different desks and actually do stuff. So it wasn't the kind of other internships where you're often sitting around with not very much to do. So that was great. That was about a month long, I think. And then I also did an epic 8-week unpaid internship at the New Statesman, which I think they now pay their interns through different schemes. But that then turned into a job very slowly. First I did a subscriptions job. So I knew they were talking about introducing these graduate trainee roles, sort of inverted commas, because there wasn't really that much training, but it was a sort of junior role, but it took a while. So first I worked on the subscriptions desk, doing an admin job for the best part of the next, maybe it was 6 months or maybe even up to a year. I can't quite remember how long it was. I did that part-time while I did an NCTJ course. And then when I finished the NCTJ course, I got this graduate trainee job. So it was basically setting up George Eaton, who's still at the New Statesman, in fact, and I were hired, and we were sort of writing online and doing web stuff. They were sort of kind of amazing to think that magazines didn't all have a established web presence, but we were basically hired to do that sort of work on the webs. And then I worked there for the next 3 or 4 years. I think I was there. I think I did an internship there in 2008, and then I basically worked there until I left in 2012.
How did you make those early years when you were doing unpaid work and you were studying work financially?
My parents live in London, so I grew up in London, so that's a huge privilege, I think, which allowed me to do unpaid internships, which I wouldn't have been able to do otherwise at all. I did some tutoring for money, so sort of, tutoring GCSE and A-level students in English. But yeah, I think that the main thing really was just having family in London who I was living with. And yeah, it was a stretch, definitely. And I think lots of people can't do it. I remember after I had the job at the New Statesman, people who were doing internships afterwards, when they still did these very long unpaid internships, there were people who were there was someone who was coming down from Newcastle and staying in a youth hostel during the week and so on. So it really was tough for people who didn't have that London base.
It's interesting what you said as well about that, it was good because you're doing real stuff as opposed to work experience where you're unoccupied. And I think in some ways that's the hidden other villainy of unpaid internships, and that if the place is not paying you, they've got no investment in you, right? They've got no skin in the game. And I remember I had that similar experience of university of sort of you arrive somewhere, you're given nothing to do. And then in America, where I was at journalism school, it was you were an intern and it was paid. And because of that, as you say, you had someone you were reporting to and you had real work and everything like that. So I think there's a sort of two-part thing in that. What about your decision to go freelance then after this period at the Statesman? What was your thinking and your motivation to do that?
I think I couldn't see a path to doing the kind of work I wanted to do at the New Statesman. So it was an amazing first job because it was a small team and I got to do all sorts of different stuff. I think much more than I would have in an entry level job at somewhere bigger. But after 3 years or so in the job, I couldn't really see a path up. I knew I probably didn't want to do kind of full-time editing, and that writing was what I wanted to do. And I wanted to do longer stuff and try living abroad and so on. And I'd been getting increasingly interested in Pakistan professionally and also on a personal level as well. And so I'd sort of been thinking about it for quite a long time. And in the end, I just decided to do it. So I, against the advice of lots of people who was sort of I mean, lots of people I spoke to just said, you've got a job in journalism, which is really hard to get at the moment. It's insane to leave it. But I just, after gearing myself up for several months, just quit. And I thought I'll give myself a year and I'll see how it works. And I quit, I think, in that June. I left and then I moved to Pakistan that September and was there until the following year. So it took quite... I was thinking about it for a long time before I actually did it, for sure.
And once you'd gone freelance, how did you build a sort of network of editors to pitch to and places that you wanted to write for?
So I think it helped that I had been a staff writer effectively at the New Statesman, so I had bylines to show and I had that name. Once I'd decided that I was leaving and handed in my notice and everything, I just frenetically asked everyone I could think of to go for a coffee with me, and that was sometimes like just blind emailing. I met up with quite a lot of foreign editors actually, although I've never been a news journalist and am still not. I sort of had in my head that that's what I should be trying to do when I was in Pakistan. So I met lots of foreign news editors. I actually didn't end up doing that much news. I sort of stuck with the features, which is where my skills are and what I've always preferred doing. But I met lots and lots of people. And then while I was away, it was just a case of pitching a lot. And it took a while to build up. And then it kind of came in multiple stages, I guess, because I had the year that I was in Pakistan and writing for people there, and you sort of get people start to know that you're doing that, and sometimes people approach you and so on. And then when I decided that I was going to move back to the UK, kind of doing it all over again, I guess, because I was just sort of thinking about what I was going to write about now that I was in the UK, because I'd sort of had not easy, but you have your set beat when you go somewhere else, and coming back and thinking, oh, there's literally anything at home that I could pitch about, and you kind of have to reframe your thinking a bit. And so some of the editors that I'd been writing for while I was in Pakistan, because I'd been doing this sort of features-y pieces, some of those editors I could pitch UK stuff to as well. I think I did a lot more of that, just sort of emailing people and going for coffees and kind of trying lots and lots of different things for a while. That's basically, I think my main bit of advice is just keep trying and keep pitching people, and also thinking a bit laterally, thinking outside just the big newspapers, for instance, and thinking about publications overseas or whatever it is.
And it's a rule of the show. We always ask about money with this. And could you tell us a bit about how, in the period you were writing your book, how you managed the different strands, so the book writing, the magazine work, and then you also did this editing work at the New Humanist, right?
Yes.
You did a couple of those a week. So how did that all fit together? And with the finances, say as much or as little as you're comfortable with, but we just like, how did you make it all work, basically?
Yeah, so I actually found the finances of book writing a total nightmare. Just before, I've been freelance now for like 9 years. It's only really took a good few years of being freelance to feel sort of comfortable financially and professionally and so on. So I think initially you have this real fear that like every bit of work you do is your last, or I did anyway as a natural worrier. That sort of lifted, and I at the point when I got the book deal, I was reasonably financially comfortable. I had a regular editing job with the New Humanist, which I still have, and doing kind of reasonably well-paid writing work and so on. And it all felt like it was sort of working. And then with the book, it was a lot harder to make it all work, basically, because what I hadn't appreciated was that you don't get your whole book advance up front. You get it generally in either 3 or 4 installments. Mine was in 4, so that's a quarter of it when you sign the contract, a quarter of it when you submit the first draft, a quarter when the hardback's published, and a quarter when the paperback's published. And that means that, my advance wasn't huge, it was fine, but it wasn't huge, that very quickly, like smallish but fine amount of money becomes a minuscule amount of money when it's being broken down into these chunks. So it ended up that I had basically a few £1,000s effectively on signing the contract, which was very frustrating because you sort of think, well, I don't need it when I'm publishing the hardback and I'm doing all my other work, or certainly the paperback in 3 years or whatever. I need it now when I'm doing the research. So that was difficult, especially coupled with the fact that I needed to pare back on my other reporting. So I think I had 15 months from signing the contract to submitting the first draft, and I initially just sort of carried on doing lots of freelance writing and my editing as well. And after a point, I had to really pare back on that The other thing was that I needed to travel for the book. It was expensive to research and paying for translation and all these different things. So I had a few grants, which I think lots of people get when they're doing nonfiction. So one was from the Society of Authors, which is amazing. They give grants out to help you with the research for a book, or you can even get them just to support you while you're writing. I also had a fellowship with Columbia University, a media fellowship. It was a sort of cross-disciplinary program that I'd done 2 years in a row, but I got it again that year, which involved a reporting grant as well as taking part in a conference. So I was able to put some of that towards doing book research as well. So I just sort of muddled through that basically. And then in terms of money to live on, I found that I was able to carry on with my editing job, which was 2 days a week. Something about it just sort of used a slightly different bit of the brain. So the last 6 months or so, I was primarily just doing editing and working on my book with the odd bit of other freelance writing. But it basically meant that my income dipped for that year and then, just sort of bounced back after I'd submitted the first draft. But it's really challenging, I think, especially if you're, as a freelancer, your income depends on what work you're doing, and you have this long stretch where you're not getting, it kind of feels like you're working unpaid, even though the money's coming later. But it's tricky for sure.
Could we talk a little bit about one of the articles you sent over, the Trojan Horse long read from 2017? Was that an idea that you pitched, or were you commissioned to do that?
Yeah, that was an idea I pitched. So I'd actually done a piece about the Trojan Horse affair when it first happened in 2014, I think it was, when I did that for the New Humanist, which is the magazine where I work part-time. So I was interested in it. And then off the back of the piece I'd done for New Humanist, one of the teachers who was involved, so I hadn't actually managed to speak to any of the teachers for that original piece. It's a fairly quick turnaround feature I'd done. But one of the teachers had seen the piece and felt that it was fair and that he wanted to talk, someone who'd been implicated in the scandal. So he'd got in touch with me via sort of several steps removed contact. And I'd already done the piece. I didn't really know what would come of it, but I met up with him for a coffee when he was in London to meet a lawyer, and I thought he was really interesting. Didn't really do anything with it for a couple of years, and then I was having a sort of ideas meeting with David Wolfe at The Guardian, and I mentioned this, and the idea for the piece then sort of grew out of that. I'd initially thought maybe I could do a sort of profile of this teacher, Razwan, who does end up in the piece, but through discussion with the Guardian long reads team, it was sort of decided we'd do a real kind of try and tell the definitive story of what had happened. So then I went back, and getting on for a year and a half I spent reporting it in the end, partly because I'd agreed with...
I was going to ask quite how long that took, because it looked like an enormous amount of legwork.
It took so long, partly because I'd agreed, Razwan was really my starting point, and I'd agreed with him that he was going through this really lengthy Department for Education professional misconduct hearing at the time, and he'd sort of agreed on the advice of his lawyers that he would speak to me on the basis that the piece wasn't published until this DFE hearing was done, which I agreed to, but then they kept delaying it because they kind of didn't really have much of a case, and they kept delaying it and delaying it and delaying it. And then every time it was delayed, I'd just sort of think, oh, well, maybe I'll just interview a few more people. And so, it was like, I think it actually ended up working in my favour, although there was a point where I was like, maybe I'm just never, ever going to be able to publish any of this, and maybe I'm never going to finish it. But it was a long stretch, good year and a half, I think.
Was it a difficult one to wrangle sort of legally, because it was involving, the government? And I don't think we've actually explained what we're talking about here. The news report that there was a sort of radical Muslim takeover of schools in Britain. Was it something that became very sensitive legally as you were reporting it?
It was sensitive on lots of different counts. It was the community in Birmingham that the scandal had focused on felt very demonised by the press. So it took quite a lot of time getting people to talk to me. And it had been such a huge national scandal that it really, people were really angry about it on all sides. So on one side, you had people really convinced that this was like a terrible extremist plot, and on the other side that it was like horrible Islamophobia. And so sort of treading a path between those two things was really challenging. Legally, I think a lot of it in terms of the government role was really outrageous. You had Michael Gove, who was the education secretary at the time, really fanning the flames and inflaming it further. Loads of leaks of really sensitive material from the Department for Education. So I think that was all felt like a sort of matter of public record, so I didn't feel too worried about that. The main difficulty was sort of the real contesting narratives that you had. But as I got further into the reporting and spoke to more and more people, the really interesting thing about it was that a lot of the time people on both sides of this really polarised case weren't actually disagreeing on the fundamental facts. So they weren't disagreeing that, for instance, religion was emphasised in the school day in some of these schools. It was just about whether you saw that as a sinister plot or whether you saw that as using the home culture of the community to motivate the kids. So it was kind of became a bit about interpretation. But it was a challenging piece on lots of different counts.
I was wondering if you think that there is a kind of common thread that runs between some of your work and maybe across the magazine and the book. And the idea I had, and you might completely shoot this down, was that do you have an interest in sort of taking a situation where there's a very strong like narrative about it, or big, like public narrative, and then lifting the lid and kind of teasing out the complexities? And the reason I asked that is about the Gatwick drone story, which I love. And it seemed obviously it's completely different in subject, but do you think, is that a fair analysis, that what you like to do journalistically is sort of lift the lid, tease out the nuance, like that sort of thing?
Yeah, definitely. I don't know if there's a snappier word for it, but like my favourite kind of story to do is sort of like, here's this really big thing that happened and, you know, here's what actually happened, if you know what I mean. So I really do enjoy doing that, something that was big kind of scandal or headline news that hasn't been quite followed up on, and going back and really putting the legwork in and trying to unpick it. I find that really satisfying, really like it.
Where did you start with the drone article? In terms of how did you want to begin your reporting?
And Samira, can you maybe just explain again what the drone article is to our listeners?
Yeah, we're talking about these things just like everyone will know what we're talking about.
We'll put them in the show notes, but give a brief heads up.
Yeah, so the Gatwick drone was in December 2018. Gatwick Airport was shut down after some alleged drone sightings. And it ended up being shot for 33 hours. And there were like well over 100 drone sightings reported in the end. And it was a cost of like millions of all these flights that were diverted and so on. And then they didn't actually ever find who'd done it. But the police were very adamant that it was a kind of really malicious, complicated plot. But there was no one ever found any drones. They didn't find any culprits. No one claimed responsibility, because initially they'd thought it might be protesters, environmental protesters, for instance, but no one claimed responsibility for it. And it was this enormous news event in the UK, but also internationally. It was really like dominated the front pages and the news broadcast for days. And then it just kind of disappeared. And then the police investigation was closed because of a lack of leads. And I was just sort of, as many people were, just sort of mildly obsessed with this story. I'd actually been on a plane coming back from a book research trip that was coming into Gatwick on the 19th of December, which is when it happened, and the flight was sort of diverted. I got off quite lightly in the end because it was just diverted to Heathrow, so it wasn't too bad. Some people were ended up in Amsterdam and all over the place. So I'd kind of been really fascinated with it from when it happened. And I sort of, when it was like a year from the incident in 2019, I was deep within writing my book. I think I just filed the first draft. I was like, I bet someone's going to do a piece about like what really happened, and no one did. So then I thought maybe I could do this. Maybe I could do this for 2 years. And then, what was your question was about how I started reporting for it. Yeah, that was tricky. So it was sort of reading around about what was there. I'd pitched it, and my editor, David, at the Guardian, said that it needed to have some kind of resolution. So his brief was basically, you need to solve it if you're going to do it, which is quite a difficult brief. So then I was trying to find new information. What really felt like a breakthrough was when I found this community of drone enthusiasts who'd been filing FOIs.
Whom you visited, right?
Yeah, I did. Ian Hudson was an amazing treasure trove. He'd been filing loads of FOI requests about it, and they'd been sort of doing a lot of sleuth work in the intervening 2 years. And so that felt like a really exciting moment, because it was just, it was, apart from the fact that, they'd been really looking into it, it was just like a great window into a completely different world, which I really enjoyed.
With a piece like that, how do you gauge the tone versus some of the other pieces that you write? How do you sort of calibrate where it should sit on the spectrum of kind of funny to obviously very serious?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess it was quite natural, actually. It was quite a fun subject. What I really liked about this story and working on it was that it was a kind of fun subject that it's got a real element of the ridiculous to it, but it allows you to get into some really serious stuff as well. A lot of stuff around like panic and changing technology and these kind of quite serious things. So yeah, I didn't want to be too mocking, but then in a way there was so much of the ridiculous in the way the story had initially unfolded. Like one of the things I wrote about the couple who were arrested by Sussex police. So I mean, it's very serious, and they had a really awful time, and their details were leaked to the press, and there was basically no basis for their arrest. But like the Mail headline was, "Are these the morons who ruined Christmas?" And then you had like police flying police drones, and then people were spotting the police drones and reporting them as drone sightings because the police drones were looking for the drones. So there was a lot of it that just was inherently quite funny, and so I think that that lent some lightness to it.
And what's your relationship with the long read now? Are you just a freelancer, or are you contracted for them? How does that work mechanically?
I'm a freelancer, although I'm talking to them about contract. So I'm a freelancer, but I am basically always in conversation and working on something for them, like most of the time. So yeah, might move to a contract potentially, but I do generally have sort of a back and forth going about ideas with them.
And how is your time divided more generally? Obviously, you do your 2 days a week of editing, but how do you divide up the remaining time between like long reads and other pieces for other publications?
It really depends, I guess, on what I'm working on. About a year, so the start of last year, I was the deputy editor at the New Humanist, and about at the start of last year, I became the editor. So it's taken up a little bit more time. So it's still around 2 days a week, but it's sometimes goes up to 3. So that's left slightly less space for freelancing, but I'm still doing long reads, but maybe a little bit less of the shorter stuff that I might have done as well. So yeah, it's a kind of mix really. I guess if I'm doing a kind of long form reported piece, I find it very difficult to work on more than one simultaneously. I have done at points, but I find it really sort of brain scrambling. So I might be doing pitching things, pitching pieces while doing the reporting or writing for a long piece, but I find it really hard to be kind of simultaneously reporting more than one thing. Or if I do end up doing 2 long form pieces simultaneously, it ends up just taking so long because I find it quite hard to there's just something about the brain space, and that's also why I couldn't. After a certain point with the book, I wasn't able to do much freelance writing alongside it. So something about holding it all in your head, the kind of feel like you need to go down a real rabbit hole to be able to be thorough and do it well. So yeah, it just kind of depends.
I find that really interesting because I find it with magazine stuff, I'm the opposite. I think there is a danger of being spread too thin, but I find the advantage of having a few irons in the fire at one stage is if you get stuck on something, or if there's an inevitable period where I suppose because these pieces have such a long life cycle, that say if you're in an access negotiation with one, that's actually a very different thing than if you're field reporting with another or going through edits. And I find, kind of similarly as you said to the benefit of having some different headspace with stuff, I find being quite hedged with that is helpful, but I suppose it's a very personal thing.
Yeah, I think I did when I was doing like sort of normal features. I found it much easier to multitask, but it's something about the kind of long format and how in depth you have to go. I find it quite hard to do, but I guess you're right that there are kind of it's often a protracted process and there's lots of delays and things, but I guess because I'm also editing, and there's often like as a freelancer just like random stuff that comes up, so I might be doing like, I don't know, like bits of radio or kind of different projects in different mediums, so I feel like I've always got lots of stuff going on, and maybe just slotting in more than one long form piece at a time is too much. But I might be pitching, like at the moment I'm reporting for a long piece for The Guardian, and I'm also working on some pitches for other places and talking to other editors about things. But I mean, that said, I am being extremely slow about getting the pitches done. So it's something about the sort of needing to go really focused on something to conceptualize it. I don't know.
Can I get one last question in? We're just quickly going to time, but it's something I really forgot to ask. What's the situation with secondary rights to your work, with TV rights and stuff like that? Is that something that you're conscious of, and do you own them, or do the publishers own them? How have you walked that one?
So it's not something I've ever really given that much thought to until recently, I guess. I know this is a big thing often for writers writing for US publications, kind of negotiating those rights. Up until last year, like quite rarely signed a contract for work, actually. The Guardian, which is my main sort of writing home at the moment, just last year, I think, introduced contracts where they retain some audio-visual rights, so it would be split 50-50 if something's optioned. But yeah, it's something that I maybe should think about more, but I haven't. It's not like US writers would negotiate this very hard on each piece, but yeah, maybe it's something to think about a bit harder.
I can see Armando Iannucci coming for your Gatwick drone story, so yeah.
Interestingly, I had loads of documentary makers getting in touch, which kind of surprised me because it's all sort of happened already and is in the past, so yeah, be interested to see.
I think it's a movie.
Yeah.
It's definitely a movie.
Well, we've reached the end of our time, but thank you so much for talking so candidly and openly about your career and about your book and the process of writing it. And good luck with everything going forward.
Thanks for having me.
Hello, it's us again. Rachel, what was your biggest takeaway from the conversation with Samira?
I found it fascinating learning more about how she reported Karachi Vice. When I was reading it, I was struck by how much time must have gone into it and how much time she must have spent with her subjects and, you know, getting to know them and spending time with their family. And I thought she did a great job of sort of inserting herself into the story where relevant and sort of taking a more dispassionate view where appropriate. How about you?
I also think the book is fascinating. The bit that really stuck with me was, though, her work on the Gatwick drone, which I think is one of the really standout pieces of magazine writing.
You love that story.
I absolutely love that story. And also, I was glad that I kind of probed as to whether there was this sort of connecting thread between her magazine work where she takes a well-known situation and lifts the lid and basically says, this is nothing like you thought it was. Which it was interesting that she kind of accorded with that as an idea, but I think that was a great piece, and I thought a really interesting interview to get a lot of really good process stuff from her. So great to have her on the show. Rachel, what's been going on with you? Well, I know you've been nominated for an award. Congratulations.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to still be considered a young journalist. Yes, at the Society of Editors Awards, which are there's a virtual ceremony on March 31st, but you are also nominated for an award, so it's a good turnout for Always Take Notes.
Yeah, we're a potentially award-winning podcast. Yes, I've been nominated for Health Reporter of the Year for my work on the pandemic, which I'm very pleased about, and good to. Yeah, there was a huge amount of work on those stories last year. It'd be great if they get some recognition. So yeah, we will see, and we'll have to see what happens at the award ceremony, which I think will be interesting, but presumably more measured than these things are often in person. And otherwise, I've just been continuing to sort of ride the wave of my.
Well, I mean, there's nothing to stop you getting really drunk at home.
staring at a Zoom screen, and otherwise, yeah, I've just been continuing to sort of ride the wave with my book, which has been fun and is ongoing. What else has been going on with you, Rachel?
I have finished finally my piece on period dramas, which should be coming out soon, so that's great. And yeah, just putting together some ideas now for my next piece, which is always my favourite part of the whole process, is coming up with the stuff, doing the research, and then it's downhill from there.
Can you disclose any of these ideas?
I could. I like to keep them close to my chest until they pay off.
You don't have to. Fair enough. Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acombe.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin. Our graphic design is by James Edgar, and our score is by Jess Danheiser.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Always Take Notes, on Twitter at Take Notes Always, on Patreon at Always Take Notes, and if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.